Okay, today we want to look at gender and development. Gender and development. Generally, when we're talking about development, any book you read, the whole issue of gender is something that's kind of left off, for the most part. It's only been within the last maybe 25 years that the issue of gender and development has been of increasing importance. But the problem with how it's been addressed is that they approach gender, the issue of gender and development, from a Western framework, a Western understanding. In Western history, Western culture, whatnot, women have maintained a subservient role. So that if you started with the European civilization, quote unquote, that Europeans trace their origins to, or claim origins to Greece, you see that in Greek society, the woman's role was simply to have babies. As a matter of fact, the Greek philosophers specifically stated that a woman was a sow, S-O-W. Just another farm animal. When you look at Greek society and you see the place that women held in society, you can see they were in a very low place. Same thing with Roman society. Women held a very low, subservient position in that society. When we look at development studies, when you look at the issue of development planning, today, any of the discussions begin with a domain of discourse which is grounded in European culture. See, the domain of discourse that you begin with is key. Because whatever the domain of discourse is, that's going to determine pretty much your thinking. What do I mean by domain of discourse? Domain of discourse is everything that's worth talking about. When we say domain of discourse, we're talking about everything that is considered to be worth talking about. As an example, if we take a history class and you look at what is included in the syllabus for the history class, that syllabus is shaping the domain of discourse. It's telling you two things: everything that's worth talking about, and also what's not worth talking about. So when we look at a history syllabus in Tanzania, you will notice that the majority of the information focuses in on colonial period and post-colonial period. The smallest section of the syllabus deals with pre-colonial period. And none of the syllabus, and when dealing with pre-colonial, they're defining a period, once again, that falls within a European conceptualization of time. What do I mean by conceptualization of time? Because I'm taking you back. Rather than just jump in and say, okay, let's discuss development and gender, we're going to go backwards to see what is philosophically the foundation. And then that'll help you understand why all the discussions about gender and development do not lead to the empowerment of African women. They lead to more of the same. They lead to that situation of difference and people confusing different with change. So, but I'm going backwards here. So now, the European conceptualization of time tells you things such as you look at how you calculate the year. And there are three different examples. You can look at the Jewish calendar, you can look at the Islamic calendar, you can look at the Christian calendar, the European Christian calendar. Another example is the Ethiopic calendar. Those are four different conceptualizations of time. Different ways of defining time. So, when we look at the history syllabus that we find in Africa, and we look at the period that's considered pre-colonial Africa, it is always set within a European construct of time. So they'll give you something, they'll always begin roughly with the European Middle Ages. The European Middle Ages, known as the European Dark Ages. The syllabus will normally start there. So that once again is limiting the discussion. Because when you're in a domain of discourse, you're in somebody's way of telling time, and they're telling you what information is important. For example, before maybe the 1960s, it was not considered important to talk about anything such as gender and development. Women didn't have a role. When you talk development, it was automatically assumed you were talking about men. And so if you're going to have development programs, then you are going to have programs that were going to be controlled by men. It's only been since the 60s that has been added in to the discussion, not because of anything African women have done wherever they're located in the world, but because of the impetus within European culture. So we want to get out of the European domain of discourse and open up the discussion so that we can actually get a solution. So when we talk about gender and development, let's look at contemporary right now, and let's see what is the issue of development. When we look at development, what are we talking about? And then why are they so poor? He gives us, because I start off by saying the current crisis. And then the first thing I want to look at is some statistics. For example, governments have often neglected women in their development policy. Why? The domain of discourse is European. In European context, women are non-issues. European and in some South Asian countries, cultures. You can go and just do a quick Google if you want to and look at family planning policies in India, China, South Asia. And you see some interesting things. For example, China has been accused that during the Chinese had a one-child policy because the population was growing so massively. And since they were subscribing to the European domain of discourse, because they were using a Marxist philosophy, they were defining the family and the problems of development within European issues. Within the European domain of discourse, so they were utilizing European ideas, not issues, but ideas. So, so when you look at those countries, you'll see the devaluation of women took place. In many of those cultures, the male is considered more valuable than the female. So there have been human rights agencies that have accused the Chinese government of supporting a program where when the family got together, you could only have one child, and you produce a child. The first child was if the child was a boy, then you kept the child. But if the first child was a girl, then there have been some claims that the child was put to death because the boy was considered more valuable economically, socially. It's interwoven within the culture. And you find that in places throughout South Asia, where the female is valued less, has a lower value. There was one documentary they were discussing that I saw, and this one was in Malaysia, Thailand, when the young lady was raped. She was about 8 years old, she was raped. So she went home. She had spent the night at a friend's house. Her friend's father raped her, 8 years old. And so then the girl goes home and tells her mother that she's been raped. And her mother's response was to take the child to a prostitution house, to a brothel, and said that she could start earning some money for the family. And so now this particular documentary was sponsored by a Canadian human rights organization. And what they had done, they were working with the Catholic Church, and they were setting up shelters because girls being either turned into prostitution or being forced into prostitution, and actually it's not prostitution, but it's survival sex, being forced into that lifestyle, they were trying to provide an option for them. Because within the culture, the male is more highly valued than the female. And you find that within these particular cultures coming out of Asia. And it gives an understanding as to why our African ancestors in the Nile Valley referred to the Asians as the wretched Asiatics when you begin to look at some of the cultural practices. But the devaluation of women within those cultures has a very long history. So it's not surprising that when you have development policy being discussed from a European domain of discourse, you get statements like, government policies have often neglected women in their development policies. All right, then they give some statistics here. And what's interesting, and these are from the 1980s, and the statistics have really not changed all that much. But he says that, for instance, in Yemen, when you looked at, this is dealing with education, primary school education. In 1987, they said there were 100 boys to girls in school in Yemen, and so, on the Arabian Peninsula. Then you come to, and Yemen is an Islamic country. You come to Chad, where you have the predominant Islamic population. The education is 100 boys for every 39 girls in school. You come to Nigeria, the numbers are 100 to 79. You come to, that's Nigeria and Ghana. You come to Kenya, it was 100 to 94. And then they tell you that in Tanzania, it was 100 to 100. So, which meant that the opportunity was the same for education for boys and girls was the same in Tanzania, just as it is in all industrialized countries. So when you sit there and you hear people talking about Ujamaa and all of these things, don't just assume that everything was horrible. Because the education policy, the healthcare policy was excellent. So that Tanzania ranked high. Now, following liberalization, you start to see the numbers coming down. By the 1990s, the numbers had dropped. And then you begin to see, with the renewed emphasis, the numbers increase again. Something else to tell you is that of the world's adult illiterates, approximately 2/3 are women. And so if the woman, 2/3 of all people who cannot read in the world are women, then that tells you a great deal about the level of literacy for the children, because the mother is the first institution that the child shall be educated by. When you look at poverty throughout the world, it is borne by women and children. Women women. Alright, there's a close connection between the education of a woman and infant mortality. The higher the level of education, the lower the infant mother mortality. Because the woman has a greater degree of education as far as healthcare issues, so she knows what to do, and then that translates itself into childbearing. Alright, so, and then finally, in Africa, 80 to 90% of all agricultural work is done by women. All 80 to 90%. Almost 100% of all agricultural work in Africa is done by women. Alright, so, and yet, development policies, when we look at them, don't emphasize women at all. One African country did do that beginning in 2000. I mentioned this the other day. Malawi. Malawi, the president at the time, he sat down and he said, okay, almost like 97 to 100% of all agriculture in Malawi is conducted by women. And he said, yeah, our development policies are focused in on these programs that are controlled by men. And the country had was having food security issues. So what he did was he said, okay, we're going to subsidize women farmers in Malawi. And they put the program. Now, remember, we said a few days ago when we were looking at the IMF and whatnot, that the IMF does not like programs that subsidize agriculture because they say it creates an unlevel playing field. So the whole idea is to have this whole issue of a level playing field for commercial agriculture. So they frown on that. And many governments, claiming to be independent governments, don't subsidize the agricultural workers in their country, which means you're subsidizing women, because the IMF says they can't do it. The World Bank says don't do it. So, because they're trapped in a domain of discourse controlled by Europeans, they don't do it. President of Malawi says, to hell with the IMF, to hell with the World Bank, we're going to do it. In 2001, Malawi had famine, food insecurity, high malnutrition. Today, they don't have that problem. Today, I read the article a few days ago, the problem they have today centers on the fact that they have a surplus of food and nowhere to sell it outside of the country because they grew enough food for the international market, but the market doesn't need all of the food they've grown. So they subsidize the women, improve agriculture. One thing we have to look at, no matter what we may think of Muammar Gaddafi, is the agriculture policy that Libya had under him. Subsidized agriculture. Remember, the majority of agriculture on the African continent is done by women. He subsidized agriculture, and no matter what you might think about Muammar Gaddafi and Libya, no matter what you think, they were food secure. They were food secure. They did not have, why? Because they didn't allow privatized land, and they subsidized the agriculture, which meant you were subsidizing women. And remember, this is a quote, unquote, Muslim country. But they say, okay, we're not going to get locked into the Quranic position of women and all of that. We're going to do what needs to be done, and what needs to be done is make sure that everybody has meat. So, the crisis we're dealing with is, because we're bringing this now back here after. So the crisis we're dealing with is we've got a situation where 90% of agriculture is done by women, and agriculture is your base industry, because everything else grows from that. If you don't have energy, you get your energy from food. If you don't have energy, you're not building housing, you're not doing much of anything. Not to mention, if the mother has poor health, she passes that on to the children. Literally. When we talked the other day talking about hunger, malnutrition, and different types of hunger, that was one of the things that they were pointing out. So, we got a big crisis. Now, why is that situation as it is? Go to Rodney help you understand that, which is why we started with him. When the colonizers came to the African continent, they found an agricultural system that was food self-sufficient and was completely controlled by women. They found a market system that was completely controlled by women. Was that because the society felt that women were better than men? No. Because that whole issue didn't enter into that wasn't even a part of the discussion. Within the African context, they said, and you can see this going back. When you when you free yourself from the European domain of discourse, then you start to looking at African history going back 10,000 years, 12,000 years. Because you're no longer trapped by that domain of discourse. You begin to see that it has been since the time immemorial in the African settings, women have controlled agriculture. Because who better knows what the family needs as far as food was concerned? The woman. She was the one that was going to know that. When you go into the Nile Valley and you look at the Africans who built Nubia and Egypt, they had a proverb. The proverb was not directed to the society for the most part, it was directed to the men. It told the men, when you're at home, shut up. I'm paraphrasing. It told the man, when you're at home, shut up. You know, the woman is going to make you feel like you're in control of the house and you have control. But understand, you know nothing. You have no idea how much food is necessary for the children. You don't even know how much, you don't know anything. So they told him, go out, do what you are supposed to do in society. But when you come home, shut up, just be quiet. Let the woman handle it. The Greeks, when they came into Africa, they said this place is backwards. Because in Greece, women had no rights. Because we're going back, we're not in the European domain of discourse, so now we're going back to 8,000, 4,000, 5,000 BC. And the Greeks said, they came to Africa and they said, this place is weird. But this is different. They say these African men are hen's heads, which was their term. They said the women ran everything. Women bought and sold in the market, women controlled the market, the women were the merchants, women controlled the agriculture. You saw the men as if, when you look at when you go to, if you ever get a chance, when you go to Egypt, and you look at the paintings, because the ancestors carved it in the temples, when you look at the paintings, you look at the pictures, notice, yeah, you see men who are the accountants and scribes, but you see men and women as the farmers. And when you see the actual farm work being done, you're seeing women being carved and painted and shown the drawing. So when the Greeks came, they said, this is weird. Women are in control of the market. Women are doing this. Women are doing that. You cannot become the pharaoh of the kingdom, but unless you are, it came through the woman. So it wasn't that, okay, I am the son of the pharaoh, I should be pharaoh. That's not how it works. And so the Greeks felt that the society was backward. And all that societies were like this. When you go into, there's an excellent book, it's called Islam in Africa, and it's a series of studies. And what's interesting is when you look at some of the Islamic scholars who traveled into Africa, they were surprised at what they saw. They say women had rights, women entertained people at home without a man being present, women controlled the market. That's our interest when we look at the studies. They're saying women controlled the market, women controlled agriculture. These are key things here. So now, when you go back to the pre-colonial period and you see how society was organized, this wasn't a place where you had it wasn't a male-dominated society, a female, and it wasn't an issue of sameness. They said, oh yes, men and women are equal, but they don't do the same things. And what you do doesn't make you more valuable than what the other one does. Everything was a relationship of harmony. So now, the current crisis, though, we see that because we're locked in the European domain of discourse, we can't solve it because we're trying to use the European models. European models and European solutions. What was the European solution to the subjugation of women? It's real simple. They started putting some women in positions that were originally men. They were originally positions held by men in European society. That was the solution. That was not changed. That was just different. Before, all of the prime ministers of the United Kingdom were men. Then in 1979, you get a woman. That wasn't changed. That was different because they didn't change the role. The role, it was the same role doing the same thing, but now it was headed by a woman. You see the same thing in other Western governments. Look at the United States. You have a female Secretary of State, the past to have been female, but the role has been the same. As a matter of fact, pay attention when you look at those countries. The women start dressing like women. They do. They start to wearing the suits like the men. They start cutting their hair like the men do, the shorter haircuts. Because the role is still considered a male role, so the women they start looking like women, and then women are supposed to look like women. They're supposed to look like men, men are supposed to look like women. You're supposed to look different. But that difference doesn't mean one is better than the other. But in those societies, that's how they address the situation, with a difference. So now, when the feminist movement began in the West, when they first started to come into Africa, I don't remember what country this was, but it was somewhere in southeastern Africa. They said one of the women was African, and they had the speaker was some lady from the West. And so the lady was speaking, was going to do this whole talk on feminism and the empowerment of women. And the African women who were on the dais, who were to be speakers with her, told her, we really don't want that here. He said, we already have a far higher position in our society than you do in yours. So we don't need the whole concept that you're bringing in to us. So let's go back though. Let's come forward now. We went backward a little bit to see how the society was organized from an African context. So now, we've got a current crisis. Walter Rodney helped us understand it's a result of conquest. We have to face it. We were conquered. Conquest, you're talking domination. That means somebody else is in control of your food, your shelter, your clothing. All of your life necessities, somebody else controls them. When we look at the current African governments, all of that stuff is controlled by Western businesses through the World Trade Organization, through the International Monetary Fund. So the situation, there's difference. When we look at the governments now, everyone is African. But that's not changed, because the policies are the same. It's the same policies. People, if you're a government and you're saying, the donors won't like us doing that, you're not free. You pretty much still got shackles and chains on you. You know you're free when you make your own decisions, irregardless as to what others may think about them. You make those decisions in your own best interest. So, Walter Rodney helped us to understand the crisis. We were conquered, and then when you have that conquered, you get a whole new domain of discourse. You're no longer discussing in your own interest. You're now locked into somebody else's definition, someone else's concepts. Someone else is telling you what is worth talking about, what is not worth talking about. So, and then what does that lead to? You get constant social upheaval. You get situations where the Democratic Republic of the Congo and South Africa are battling for the title of great capital of the world. A massive, now is that traditionally a part of African society? No. These are all the symptoms of conquest and domination. And utilizing someone else's domain of discourse, someone else's definition of what a man is, someone else's definition of what a woman is. That's what all of that is coming from. So when we're sitting here, we're watching, and you see, now, where do these things occur? In areas where you have high poverty, high social dislocation, high chaos, great deal of chaos. Then you find when you're locked into a Eurocentric worldview, because the woman is merely booty, she is merely something to be won, the prize. The pirates, the whole concept of booty, they attack the ship, and they go in, and they would take everything that was on the ship. That was the prize. That was the booty. That's where the term booty comes from. So, within the Western context, the woman is the prize. Remember? If you look at how they describe relationships, you say a woman is merely a prize to be won. See, it's the prize to be won. That's a whole different mindset on the woman. What do we do with prizes? If you're in a competition and you win the competition and you get the trophy, what do you do with the trophy? It's your prize. You sit it on the shelf. You put it up there on the shelf to be seen by everyone. It's a prize. That's what a prize is. Those statements like keep your eyes on the prize and all of that, you have to really think about because that's out of somebody else's domain of discourse. So we get these situations here. You get this issue of rape, which is you find. Look at European culture again. The great incident that led to the foundation of the Roman society was a rape. And I mean, it's in the history books. I can't remember the name of the woman at this moment, but at first the Etruscans controlled Roman society. They were in control. And apparently some Roman woman was raped. That incident is what led to the overthrow of the Etruscan kingdom and the establishment, quote unquote, of the Roman Republic. A rape. There's a painter, a very famous painting, which is out of Greek history. And it shows that the entire story centers around a mass rape. They raped every woman that was in the society. So when you go and you look at the cultures that are giving birth to a given domain of discourse, of course those cultures, when you take on their culture, of course you're going to have issues like rape occurring. Because the woman has been devalued. She has no value. And if something has no value, you can do whatever you want to it. See, if you value a woman, you don't beat a woman as a man. A man doesn't beat a woman. Because a man has value for the woman. Remember, when you left heaven, you entered the world through the legs of a woman. That's how God arranged it. You came into this world through a woman. So when you value a woman, you don't beat her. But when a society devalues a woman, European society devalues females. It's all there for everyone to see. You just read the history. They tell you this. If you look at English society, the English, and when the English conquered the Irish, the English lords and whatnot, these English nobles, they had the right that everyone who, whenever, say, an Irish couple was going to get married, and before the man would sleep with his wife, the lord who owned all the land and whose land they were living on, he had the right, and they called it primogeniture. He had the right to sleep with the man's wife first. And many times they exercised that right. That's within English culture. That's a devaluation of the woman. She is merely a prize, a thing, something that you use. So obviously, when you take that culture, you're going to get the devaluation. You can see the role of the woman when you look at the different religious texts. Look at the Jewish religious text and the role of the woman. The woman's role. The value placed on the woman. You see the same thing in the Bible. You see the same thing in the Quran. If you bother to read all three of them, and you're going to go and study. You know, most folks, we go to college and study Islamic religion, Islamic studies. You go study biblical studies. You study Jewish studies. When you look at it, the role of the woman is you don't have an elevated role. If you get to analyzing it, you start to seeing that. What is God within those religions? God is a what? He's male. God is male. So, God, that's an elevated state. What is woman? The source of evil. Look at the whole story of Adam and Eve. You can read it in either of those two. Who is actually accused of having done wrong? Was it Adam? It was a woman. They're showing you within that story, they're telling you evil enters the woman, he enters the world through the act of a woman. They are defining for you on a subconscious level a woman's place, a woman's role. What does any of these religions tell you? Women are supposed to be submissive. Submit to your husband. Just as just as the church submits to Christ. Submit. A woman, I suffer. What did Paul tell you? Paul, who never got married. And apparently never had a woman. What does Paul tell you? He says, he suffers not a woman to speak. She should be in the church, but be silent. You know, they are defining for you, within the culture that gave birth to these particular religious orientations, they're defining for you the role of the woman. There's a story in the Old Testament of one of the judges, one of the less known judges in the book of Judges. And the judge, he tells God that if you give me this victory in combat, then I shall sacrifice the first living thing that I see. And so, they get the victory in the war, and defeat the enemy, and he comes back and he sees his daughter running down the road to greet him. And so then he goes and he starts to cry and he tells his daughter that why did he's all upset. She says, no, go ahead and do it. Oh, what does Lot do in the book of Genesis? When the angels coming from God, male, when those angels come and tell, God sends the angels to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, what does Lot do when the men of Sodom want to sodomize or rape the men? He says, no, do not do this evil thing, my brothers. I have 2 daughters who have not known man. Here, take them and do what you will. The story is defining for you the role of the woman within those cultures. So if you got a religious text that can do that, of course, you can be a Christian and sit there and then go out and rape a woman and then come back and do whatever. Or you can be, I was on the internet and someone created this story, they created a picture. And the picture showed they showed Muslim women. And there was a story coming out of Egypt, and I have a PowerPoint presentation on it. The story coming out of Egypt was the story came from Egypt, but it was actually from Saudi Arabia. And it was a beautiful one. She was beautiful. And she was on television. Saudi Arabia was somewhat liberal, kind of, sort of, in some way. But she was on television, and she wasn't wearing the veil over her face. She was a news reporter. And so apparently something happened when she went home. She and her husband got into an argument. And her husband literally stumped her face in. He left the boot print he was wearing on her forehead. So this beautiful woman's face was all swollen up and it was messed up. And so what she decided to do was to allow herself to be photographed. Because she wanted to call attention to the fact that women were being beaten. Women were being brutalized and beaten within the culture. So, but of course you can do that within the culture when the text itself devalues the woman. So what we have when we look into the DRC in South Africa, we see the woman being devalued. We see the devaluation of the woman. The removal of the woman from the place within the African context that she originally had. So now, what we have is a war against African women. When you look at the culture, when you look at the colonizers when they came, they tell you the type of society they encountered. And you see what their actions were to destroy that type of society. In order to destroy the African society as it was originally built, you had to destroy the role of the women, which meant you had to wage a war on women. An excellent novel which dramatizes this is the book 2,000 Seasons by Armar. Armar is an author from Senegal. But in 2,000 Seasons, there's a section in the book where he starts first with the Arab colonizers coming in. And he tells you that before, women had a respected place in society. Then the Arabs came in through conquest, and he says that it was the women who led the overthrow of the Arabs who were in control. But they say once they began to re-establish African society, it says the African men began to be, they kind of liked some of the things the Arab men had done. You know, how they had placed women in certain positions, the role of the women. So they wanted to maintain that. And he tells you that other women just went along with it to reestablish the society. Then in a later section in the novel, he dramatizes the Christian missionaries coming through and the type of society they sought to establish. And then the rest of the book ends with the rest of the novel focuses in on people who were trying to reestablish the African way. It's an excellent novel because it dramatizes 500 years on what occurred culturally, and it points out what happened to the role of the woman in African society. So, and that's why I have here cultural imperialism, because when you wage war on African culture, you wage war on the position of women. All right, so now I come here. I've got biological origins. Because, once again, we're going to change the domain of discourse. So let's go back to the beginning. You know, in the beginning, and I don't mean in the beginning when God created the earth and all that stuff, but in the beginning, we all began as something. There is a theory that is known as the Inductor theory of primary sexual differentiation. It's a long term, talking about human biological origins. How we actually begin. And within that theory, I'm not going to read the whole piece, but within this theory, they tell you that, strictly speaking, we can no longer refer to an undifferentiated phase of embryonic existence. They say that in the beginning, the theory was that when the male sperm and fertilized the female egg, at the very beginning, they say that was nothing. It wasn't male or female. It was just a thing that would eventually develop into a male or female. That was the old theory coming out of Europe. The inductor theory tells you that the early embryo is female. In the beginning, we were all created female, and if this were not so, we would not be here at all. In the beginning, in our mother's womb, we begin as a female. The male component, the male development, and if I read the rest, they get into the actual, it says, if the genetic sex is established at fertilization, the moment the seed fertilizes the egg, the sex is determined. You begin as a female. They say, but the influence of the sex genes is not brought to bear until the 5th or 6th week of fetal life. The male concept is something where you have to add something more to. That's why we have statements like we say things like, act like a man, be a man. You never say, act like a woman, be a woman. See, if you were naturally a man, you don't have to say, act like, if you were naturally a man, then your malehood would be defined by a piece of the human anatomy, which states that you're a man. If you have that anatomy, then you're a man, quote unquote. But if that was all it took to be a man, then you wouldn't have to, there would be no such statement as act like a man. Because there's something more. That is why in traditional African society, they took the male away at about 12, 13 years. And in some societies, the man didn't come back. Like the Samburu, when they take the male away, he stays gone until he's like 18, 21 years old. What are they doing? They are training him to be a man. Because there's something more. Biologically, something more has to occur. For the first 6 weeks, we are female, and then there is a development. If it's going to be a male, then the development will occur. That's what the inductor theory is telling you. Now, what's interesting is that when you start looking back into the Nile Valley several thousand years ago, the African ancestors told you the same thing. In traditional African society, they're telling you the same thing. Alright, so why do I go back here? Because if you have this concept of human origins and human life, that everything is beginning as a female, then you're going to do something that you generally only find in African traditional religions. God is female. When you look at the earliest representations of the Creator, it is female. When you look at African traditional religious systems, you don't just see a male God. You see a female balance. See, if you define the woman as a goddess, then you've also changed your entire thinking about women. So suddenly, you now have a different value. You know, it's the whole concept you saw during the 60s and the 70s when they were talking about the representation of God. And they were focusing in on the representation, and they were telling you that if God was represented as white, then you were automatically transferring all of the attributes of the white God to every white person you met. So that you would be unable to do what you needed to do if that white person was trying to harm you. And so you began to see the representation of God as black. Well, we're taking the same philosophy. If you represent the Creator as female, then suddenly you're probably not trying to beat the living crap out of a woman for any stupid thing, or for any stupid reason. So this is very key to understanding the role of the woman within society. If you go back to the biology, you study the biology, then you understand that in the African conceptualization of the biology, within the African domain of discourse, we begin as female and then we develop into the male if necessary. So now, staying within the African context and looking at the role of the woman, if we go back to the Nile Valley again, and we look at a religious story from the Nile Valley, Osar and Aset. Osar is credited with bringing civilization to them. He brought them agriculture. When you read the story, the first thing he tells you that was brought into this African society was the science of agriculture, cultivation. And so then he helps the people develop the society and civilization. And then he sets out into the rest of the world to take the same learning, the same cultural concepts. And he leaves his wife in total control of the society. Alright, when he returns, his brother, jealous of him and wanting to assume the throne, kills him. And then within this story, they tell you that it is the woman who goes, finds all of the pieces of her husband, puts them together, and then produces a child. Now, getting away from whether this was true or not, look at what the story is telling you. The story is telling you that it was the role of the man to set up and lay the foundation for the society. And then the story is telling you when the society fell into chaos, it was the woman who put the society back together. If you have development and you are not educating the women, you're not doing anything with regards to the women, you have damned the society, the nation, to poverty and death and destruction. Because, and then there's another example from that society where the woman is represented as right thought, as ma'at, right thought, and the man was right action. So it was the woman who did the thinking and the man who carried out the acts. You know, pretty much like it is generally in a marriage. You know, no matter what I was in Iran. And so I was amazed that, you know, you think this is a society where the men are in control. Because you're told, you know, it's a traditional Muslim society, the men are in control. So there was this one guy, he and his wife owned this building. with a family. I mean, where a family could come and live. And a young woman wanted to rent the apartment for her and her daughter. And so the man was like, I got to check with my wife. And I'm like, wait a minute. I thought you said this was a male-dominated society. So in a relationship, in marriages, generally, the woman does the thinking and the man carries it out. And this is what they were laying down several thousand years ago. So now, what is the role of the woman within the African context? What is her role? What is the role of the man when it comes to African development? It's pretty simple. Real simple. It says the African woman is to be the bearer and the nurturer of the race, the counselor of the nation. She provides leadership, she provides a purpose, she provides vision for her children, and stability for her family. And what is the man's role within this situation? The African manhood can only be viewed in the context of our success or failure to uplift our nation, to educate our nation, to liberate our nation, and to ensure the independence of all African people. We must never value men who talk over men who think, and we must ignore men who think over men who act, but we must reserve the highest honor for those men who take thoughtful action. And a man is only taking thoughtful action in the African context when he is in communion with the woman. Balance. Balance. So, what is the role of the woman in African development? If you're going to improve African agriculture, you're going to save the environment and maintain it, you must subsidize African women. They're the ones conducting all of the agriculture. If you're going to improve the nation, you want to know the quality of the nation, look at the level of education of the women. You must deal with that. That is going to lead, which means you're going to have to engage in cultural change. You have to get away from the Eurocentric culture and move to African values and African education and African interests, where your whole actions are concerned simply with is what I'm doing in the best interest of African people. All right, I will see everybody next week.